Good morning. I hope everyone's well. If you can hear in my voice, and if you noticed I was being fairly unsociable, it's because I just don't want to spread the plague to everybody else. So, bear with me. Anyway, we are again talking about fear, and fear is an incredibly important topic today because if you've noticed, wherever you stand on the political spectrum, there are lots of reasons to be afraid and to be anxious, whether you love the president or can't stand him, whether you're Democrat, Republican, whatever. The political situation in America is a mess, and it's a huge cause for fear and anxiety. And even not just there, in the global space, there are madmen wielding nuclear warheads as though it was a game. There's a lot of reason to be afraid just on a global perspective. And there are plenty of reasons to be anxious about, for example, the economy, which is supposedly growing, but I've noticed, especially in areas like California, it seems to just be getting harder and harder to afford to live here and really thrive. And I know some of your stories, there are plenty of things going on amongst our members here at St. Paul's that are huge causes for fear and anxiety. Fear is a big thing. And the problem is that fear is really a cancer. Fear is a cancer that grows and expands and it spreads. But not just a cancer, fear is also an asthma. It tends to choke you out. And we know from neurological research that there's a reason for this. And the research is growing and expanding, and I can't even pretend to understand all of it or even a lot of it. But one thing is for certain, is that fear disables our ability to think rationally and creatively. It disables our ability to think rationally and creatively, which is to say the thing that makes us humans so unique in all of the created order is our ability to think with logic and creativity. But if somebody is afraid or they are just racked with anxiety, they're not going to be able to function like that at all. If you can think about a time when you were freaking out, you were anxious, you were afraid of something, and you were ratcheted up, did somebody try and calm you down by explaining the situation and giving you reasons why you shouldn't be feeling afraid? And if they did, I guarantee you it did not work. Because our brains get disabled. We can't do it. Which is also why if you've come to somebody that maybe you're even close to and they've been racked with anxiety, they've been really afraid, and you can't, you're going to be okay because this reason, therefore this reason, it doesn't work. First, they have to calm down. And neurological research is actually giving us profound insight into why that is. So fear, if it disables our ability to think creatively and with reason over a long enough time, will lead to hopelessness. Because hopelessness is often the result of our inability to see anything beyond this moment of fear or pain or suffering or struggle, however you want to say it. So we can't focus on anything larger than just this moment, and it also is a result from our inability to see that maybe there are plenty of solutions or plenty of ways that this is going to work out just fine. And again, if fear is doing what it does, we cannot think rationally, we cannot think creatively. All we can see is just this moment. We will eventually lose hope. I'll give you a really dumb example where I am going to come clean and say that in certain situations I am a neurotic mess. And that is, for many of reasons, but for one in particular, I hate being late. And it's not because I have like these really strict standards on how I am and how I live my life, and I'd like to think that in some cases I do, but it's because I'm a little insecure and I don't ever want to be known as the guy who's always late. I just don't want to be that guy because I don't want people to think bad about me, even though there are plenty of other reasons to. So imagine this scenario, and I've found myself in this scenario many times. I've got something I need to go to. I'm expected to be there at a certain time, so I get on the freeway, and I engage then in, I guess, Orange County's favorite pastime, which is being stuck in traffic. And you're stuck, and now traffic, like a hopeless situation, feels meaningless a whole lot of the time. Why? Because what happens, it seems like at least half the time, if not more, you get to the end of the traffic, and it's dispersing, and things are clearing up, and you realize there's no wreck, there's no backup, there's no other highway merging into it. People just apparently decided to stop for no reason. And you're freaking out, and it just feels meaningless. But then you're stuck in traffic, and you're watching the clock, and you realize, I'm going to be late. And so that fear starts to build, that anxiety, which is shutting down my ability to think rationally and make any sense of meaning out of this. And so if I'm at my most neurotic, I will, and this happens slightly more than I'd like to admit, you get there, and you get to this point, and you realize, I'm just going to die here. I'm never going to get out of traffic. They're going to find my body just clutching the steering wheel in frustration. I'm never going to get there. Everyone's going to be mad at me because I'm late. This is never going to get any better. Now, that's a dumb example, but that's what hopelessness does. You cannot see anything beyond just this moment of fear, and you cannot see how it might be resolved. A much more difficult example is that as a pastor, I've seen this a few times, and one in particular stands out, but I won't give any details for anonymity's sake. You get a really hard diagnosis. And so as a pastor, I get to walk with them, which is often a great joy. But you get a lot more downs than ups as treatment progresses, and things get harder. It seems like you get a moment of respite, and then things just get worse. And watching this happen and trying to minister to them, you realize that they're losing hope because they can't see how God may be transforming them, what God may be doing in their lives. And they can't make any meaning out of it either. And so they give up. And you can guess how that story goes. When we lose hope, it is like end-stage fear. It is one of the things that fear will ultimately do to us. And so we come to the text. Luke 8 is a very interesting pair of stories sort of sandwiched together. And at first glance, or first listen, you might have thought, well, this story makes a lot of sense. Okay, people have issues. One of them, one little girl's near death. One of them has a health issue. And you think, well, Jesus is here, so he's going to heal them, which he does. Okay, the end. But this is one of those stories where if you start asking questions or start picking out little details here and there, you realize the story actually makes very little sense. For example, why did that woman who was bleeding for 12 years reach out and grab Jesus' cloak? Why would you do that? If somebody came up to me and started pulling on my jacket, I'd probably awkwardly shuffle away. And if they kept doing it, we need to talk about boundaries or something like that. Why was she afraid when Jesus sensed that some power had gone out of him? And what does that whole power going out of him really mean in the first place? Last I checked, Jesus is not a wizard. And Jairus comes and he wants his daughter to be healed. Okay, that makes sense. But then when people come to him and say, like, don't bother the teacher anymore, your daughter is dead, why was that the definitive point where Jesus could no longer help? And when Jesus enters the house and he asks, or only the parents of the daughter and his three inner circle, Peter, James, and John, into the house, why are they only the ones allowed there? And when she's raised from the dead, why does Jesus insist that she get something to eat? There's a lot of questions that linger, and for good reason. Well, it turns out both of these stories are in effect hopeless. We'll start with the woman, bleeding for 12 years. Some kind of gynecological thing. There's no way for us to kind of figure that out definitively. But bleeding like that will lead to a very hopeless situation, because in ancient Jewish culture, including certain modern cultures, modern Jewish societies, when blood flows, that person becomes unclean. Now, this is not a moral issue. It's not like a woman sins, for 5 to 7 days every month or something like that. It's just blood is flowing, so they become unclean. And when the blood stops, they undergo a mikvah, a ritual washing, and they become clean again. But that can't happen if the blood doesn't stop. And when you are unclean, it means you cannot interact with your community in many meaningful ways. You have to be separate from them. Because if somebody clean, ritually clean, comes in contact with someone unclean, then they contract that uncleanness. So she's living an isolated life. She also cannot take part in the temple sacrifices and the prayers and the festivals that are oriented around the temple. Like, say, Passover. You want to eat Passover in Jerusalem and go to the temple and do the sacrifices. That would be like saying you have this medical issue, so you can't take part in Christmas. And so she is isolated from her community. She is isolated from her faith. And she had spent a ton of money that she had on doctors. Some of the other gospel writers, Matthew specifically, includes some more of these details. And he includes the detail that it made her worse. Interestingly enough, you don't see Luke saying that, because early church tradition says that Luke was a physician. So I think he just doesn't want to badmouth his own profession. But I had a professor as an undergraduate who actually did some painstaking research into exploring what kind of treatments an ancient physician would have offered a woman with this kind of blood flow issue. And as it turns out, I'm sparing you the details because I'd like to stay employed. Let's just say there is no doubt it made her worse. Wow. So this woman is in a hopeless situation. She is living an isolated, lonely life because of this issue, even though it's not a moral issue. She has gone from doctor to doctor who have offered treatments that don't work, and if you've ever had that experience, that is a soul-crushing thing. And so in her hopelessness, she hears about this guy, Jesus, this teacher who obviously has this following. And she thinks that in some way he can offer her healing, and oddly enough, she picks his cloak. So our question would be why? Now, this cloak that Jesus is wearing is called a talit. Modern Jews will wear, or Jewish men anyway, will wear talit, specifically during times of prayer and other sacred times. So, but Jesus, in his day, they would have worn them all the time. It's a cloak with 4 corners, kind of worn over their robes, and on each corner is what's called a tzitzit, like a tassel. And there's all kinds of symbolism there, and a reminder of God's presence. And Jewish men are commanded to wear these in Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. Now, over time, the prophets, as they were talking about the age when Messiah comes, and really another way of saying that is that when God finally does what he has promised he is going to do, when he reestablishes Israel, he brings justice to the land. The kingdom of God is here, and it is real, and this is when God is fully, finally present with his people, that it's going to look certain ways. And so I've got some, just a couple of quick little single verse passages from some of the prophets. So this is from Malachi, or as a friend of mine likes to say, this is the only Italian prophet, Malachi, which I still don't think that's funny, but I get it, whatever. I'm not Italian. But he says, again, about this era of Messiah, says, "But for you who fear my name, the Son of Righteousness shall rise with healing in its wings. You shall go out leaping like calves from the stall." Now, there's a lot of prophetic imagery there, but I want to focus on the healing in its wings. The word for wing is kanaf. Wings, plural would be kanafim. It's, we'll get there in a second. Go to the next one, Zechariah chapter 8. "Thus says the Lord of hosts." This is, again, in the days of Messiah. "In those days 10 men from the nations of every tongue shall take hold of the robe of a Jew, saying, 'Let us go with you, for we have heard that God is with you.'" The word for robe is also chanaf. And in other places, when God speaks to like Moses or his people, and he talks about the Exodus, when God rescued his people from Israel, he says, I bore you out as though on the wings of an eagle, or the chanaf, or chanafim of an eagle. That under the wings of the Lord is healing. So this concept of within the wings of God are healing, or the chanaf or chanafim of God is healing. The rabbis started, and I don't need that up anymore. The rabbis started making these connections between this word chanaf, which usually would just mean the corner of the robe. Now, and this is called remez in Jewish interpretation, where you are looking for hints that God has something else in mind, something a little deeper. And one of the ways you do it is you track the way this word is used, and you kind of bring it together. There's a whole bunch of rules behind it, and I don't really understand all of them. But it came to be understood by the time of Jesus that when Messiah comes, under his wings, or his chanafim, which would be his talit, his shawl that he wears over his robe, that they would provide healing. Now, if you're really studious and you want to really dig deep, look through the book of Luke and Acts, and note every single time the garment of somebody associated with Jesus heals somebody. The answer is a fair amount. So when this woman comes up to Jesus and says, all I need to do is grab his cloak, the corner of his cloak, the chanaf of his talit, then I will be healed. What is she saying? This is no mere teacher. This is not even a healer. But this is God doing what he's finally promised he would do. The prophets of old said that under his wings would be healing, that you would grab his cloak and say, take me to where God is because God is with you. That this is now here. That Jesus is Messiah. This is a very bold statement of faith in such a way that not really everybody gets at this point. So then Jesus has this moment where he realizes power kind of left him or something, and just for what it's worth, I don't really understand what that means, and all the descriptions that I read were pretty unconvincing. But I love that moment when he's like, who touched me? Somebody touched me. And his disciples are going, there's an entire crowd around you. Everybody's touching you. But something special happened. This woman identified Jesus for who he really is. This is God here in person. This is Messiah. And she freaks out. Why? Because she's unclean. And everybody she touched in that crowd is now unclean. And even worse, she touched the chanaf of the talit of Messiah, which means he is now unclean. Which is why she trembles. And Jesus' response is that your faith has made you well, which is not a great translation. It's actually your faith has saved you. Jesus is not afraid to enter into the messiness of life. He's not afraid of becoming unclean if it means a daughter of Israel is healed. And then people come from Jairus' household. And they say, don't bother the teacher anymore. Your daughter has died. Now, why would that be the moment where we no longer have hope? It's because of this weird thing that I've noticed about humans is that when they die, they tend to stay dead. The point isn't that people are raised from the dead all the time, and Jesus was raised from the dead, so it's just kind of, that's just another one of them. No, the point of Easter, of Jesus being raised from the dead, is that people don't rise from the dead. So when Jesus did, something weird, something cataclysmic just happened. That death at this point is the loss of hope. But Jesus enters into that hopelessness and says, just believe. So he comes to the house, and there are mourners that are wailing and making kind of a general chaotic mess of things. That's their job. They paid them to sing these songs of sadness and dirges and stuff like that. It was a cultural thing. And Jesus removes them from the house. He takes a chaotic situation and brings peace to it. He sends everybody away, except for 5 other people. And he enters the house, which he should not have done. Because that house has a dead body in it, and if you enter into that house and approach the dead body, you are now unclean. Except Jesus is already unclean from the woman he just healed. Again, Jesus will enter into chaos and mess if it means bringing hope. And he tells the girl to get up, and she does. And then he wants her to eat something because, as it turns out, eating something means that she's not like just this apparition or this hallucination. When Jesus was raised from the dead, he asks for something to eat. So his disciples don't think that they're just like they ate something bad and something seeped into their brains. But actually, this is really Jesus. And one of my favorite appearances after he was raised is that his disciples are fishing in Galilee, and on the shore, what is Jesus doing? Barbecuing some fish. He's just making breakfast. Shows this profound physical resurrection to show that death, even though it was hopeless, has now been transformed to life. This is a profound moment of hope. Jesus takes those darkest moments and provides both meaning to that suffering and then a promise that things will get better. Because the most profound moment where this happens, and this is the moment where we as believers in Jesus are most connected to him, is that when Jesus is dying on the cross, he says what? My God, why have you forsaken me? The only time when God has withdrawn his presence from a human being was his own son as he lay dying. That is the only moment where there was no hope. And yet, that was transformed because Jesus 3 days later walked out of his tomb. The most hopeless situation becomes the defeat of death itself. And if we are baptized into Jesus' death and raised with him in new life, then we have been given this promise that no matter how dark things get, no matter how terrifying they are, no matter how anxious they are, that they are just a single moment in your life. This is a small part of this much larger story that God is telling. That all roads, all threads of story lead to the moment of Jesus' hopeless death and out of his tomb in the ultimate defeat of any hopelessness. That your lives are promised to be redeemed. That your suffering, the things that you fear most when you are confronted with them, are just a small part of a much larger story of redemption. That God can redeem anything. When we talk about faith in terms of fear and specifically how fear can turn into this hopeless monster that sucks the lives out of us. We realize that Jesus is not afraid to enter into the mess, into the chaos, into the uncleanness of our lives. That he will give us this promise, or he does give us this promise, that regardless of how dark this moment is, how terrified you really are, that this is part of a much larger story. It has meaning. It is not the end of this story, but it has an arc. It is heading somewhere different. And that God redeems all suffering. If he can redeem the senseless death of Jesus on the cross, he can redeem whatever it is that you are facing now. And yet God never promises us a specific outcome. In the stories, Jesus heals. But he doesn't always. But we have a promise that even on the last day, when all the dead have been raised and we see all of human history unrolled like a scroll, that we will look back and realize that the story that God was telling with our lives is one of redemption. Even if it is not the outcome we choose, even if we are forced to face fears that we never would have desired, the story that God is telling is one of redemption and resurrection. When we encounter our fears, our anxieties that life throws us, and there's a lot of them, may we know that God enters into our existence through Jesus. That he has given these moments of pain and fear and struggle and given them meaning because they are set into a much larger story. And that story is one of redemption. That God will redeem all things, even that thing you are so afraid of. Because that is the story he's telling of all history. Let's pray.